I've been using the M5 MacBook Air pretty much every day for the past 4 months, and despite also owning the M5 MacBook Pro, it's been mostly collecting dust. I actually feel kind of guilty about that, but after months of using both, I think I finally now know why. So let me explain. Okay, so I've said this before, but I'll say it again. I am a base model guy, especially this year with the storage increasing. So the MacBook Air now starts at 512 gigs of storage, and the MacBook Pro starts at 1 terabyte of storage. And before, just very recently, you didn't see any price increases with the added storage. But now we have new pricing. So the M5 MacBook Air starts at $1,300 and the M5 MacBook Pro starts at $2,000. There's a $700 difference between the two now. Now you might also be able to find these cheaper on Amazon. I will leave those linked down in the description below, but the price, now being increased could sway your decision. But something that could sway your decision even more is the design and the comfort, because to me, that is one of the biggest differences, period, with the MacBook Air and the MacBook Pro. The MacBook Air is thin, it's light as a feather, and it's fanless, so it's always quiet even when you're pushing it hard. Meanwhile, the MacBook Pro is much thicker, it's much heavier than the Air, and it's one of those things you will notice every single time you pick it up or you travel with it. And travel is one of the main, differences between the Pro and the Air, like in terms of when I personally decide to use one or the other. Now, it's not that the Pro is bad to travel with, it's just that the Air is so much more convenient with things like, putting it in your backpack and taking it out of your backpack. It takes up less space. It's also less weight on your back, so it doesn't make your back as sore. Not going to be a huge difference there, but it is something I always notice. Also with the airplane tray, like when you're on a plane, the tray table, it's much better to have the Air on there than the Pro. I also just like carrying around the MacBook Air, like around coffee shops or places like that. It's not as heavy as the Pro. Now, it's not going to make a massive difference, for just short walks, but it's just something you notice over time. The Pro really shines when you're just sitting at a desk, or like when you have your MacBook hooked up to an external monitor, or if you just don't travel a lot, the MacBook Air doesn't have as many advantages for you. So yes, the Air is more comfortable, but if we look closer at the design, the Pro has some major advantages that have caused me to leave the Air behind in many scenarios. So first off, the Air does have more fun color options with the sky blue, the one I have here, along with silver, starlight, and midnight. Meanwhile, the Pro just keeps it simple with the silver and space black. I decided to get silver for my M5 Pro. The trackpad is going to look and feel the same on both of these. They're still both the best in the industry by far, in my opinion, in terms of trackpads, but the keyboard is where you will see a little bit of a difference here. I actually prefer the keyboard on the MacBook Pro to the MacBook Air. It's kind of hard to explain, but when you're typing on it, you can feel more depth. It's kind of more sturdy on the MacBook Pro and just feels a little bit more premium than the Air. But that's not the only area where I prefer the Pro over the Air. There are a few other areas where the Pro is just so much better than the Air, and one of those is with the display. The display on the Pro is a lot better than it is on the Air for multiple reasons. So the MacBook Pro has a mini LED display and the MacBook Air has an LCD display. So the colors have higher contrast on the Pro. There's deeper blacks, there's brighter HDR highlights. You're just going to notice a lot of that on the Pro, and the brightness overall is also going to be much higher on the Pro. So it's 1000 nits standard, whereas the Air only gets up to 500 nits. The Pro also has the ProMotion display with 120 Hz refresh rate, whereas the Air just has the standard 60 Hz. And for me personally, it does not make a massive difference on a laptop. I notice it occasionally when I'm scrolling really fast through web pages, but it's not something that's going to be as noticeable as like it is on the phone or an iPad. Now, I should also mention HDR, because this mini LED display also helps a lot with HDR. So the Air, it can play HDR content, but it cannot reproduce true HDR like the Pro's mini LED display can. So HDR is just tone mapped to fit the Air's standard LCD. So basically, like when you're editing photos in Lightroom or when you're watching videos in HDR, you will see the difference. Like it's much better on the Pro over the Air. But an even bigger difference is going to be with the nano texture display. So this is a $150 add-on for the Pro only, and this is going to be something that is going to make your life so much better when it comes to glare and reflection. So I absolutely love nano texture, and I had it on my M4, but I didn't get it on the M5 since I didn't really know if I was going to keep it or not, but I do plan to exchange it for nano texture later on down the road, because I think nano texture is amazing. If you're somewhere where you're in a lot of sunlights, or if you're in coffee shops a lot and you can always see people walking by in the screen, it's so annoying and so distracting. Nano texture completely eliminates that. Or if you just have like lights on the ceiling or behind you, if there's just windows shining onto your screen, it just makes it sometimes so you can't even see what's on your screen. So it kind of ruins the experience experience if you're out and about with your laptop. So I think it's great. It also doesn't really mute the colors a lot. A lot of people seem to think that it like really ruins the color profile, but it doesn't. And I'm somebody who color grades in Final Cut Pro. Like I am very specific with my colors, and it does not, make it like a deal breaker for me. So I love nano texture. That's also a big advantage of the Pro. But to be honest, unless you're doing like a lot of color grading or a lot of photo editing or a lot of, watching really specific colors of movies, you're not going to see a massive difference in the Pro and the Air in terms of the display. Like for me personally, I see a big difference because I'm looking at the colors. I'm doing a lot of the color grading and things like that, and I really notice that. But if you're just web browsing, using web apps, using your PowerPoint, using all that, it's not going to make a big difference. So I'd much rather put that money towards like upgrading the storage or upgrading the RAM. Now, on the topic of storage, unless you maxed out the storage option, you're going to eventually run low on space. And when that time comes, you'll be glad to have today's sponsor, Clean My Mac. And that's because Clean My Mac helps you eliminate junk files and hidden files to regain that storage back. So I use this right here, the Space Lens feature, every week to visualize my storage and spot those big unnecessary files. If you run the Smart Care scan, it'll give you an overview of what's taking up space, and it just takes one click to remove those files. Also on this left menu, you have Cleanup to clear the cache and junk files, Protection to scan for security threats, Performance to manage background tasks, Applications to properly uninstall apps and remove leftover files, My Clutter to remove duplicate or large and old files that you may no longer need, and then they also have this Cloud Cleanup right here for cleaning up your iCloud, Google Drive, or OneDrive accounts. And easily one of my favorite parts of Clean My Mac is the menu bar interface. So you just click on this and it gives you quick access to your available storage, your CPU and RAM pressure, your temperatures, your Wi-Fi speeds, and more. And plus, this whole application just looks so aesthetically pleasing. So if you want to try out Clean My Mac free for 7 days, click my link in the description below. And if you use my code Brandon20, you'll get 20% off. Now, there is also a difference that's even bigger than the display, and I think that is the port selection, because this, to me, was the biggest reason that I chose to use the Pro over the Air in certain scenarios. So on the side of the MacBook Pro, we have 3 Thunderbolt 4 ports, 2 on the left, 1 on the right, and on the Air, we only have 2 Thunderbolt ports, and they're both on the left. Now, the Pro also has an HDMI port and an SD card slot on the right, which is huge for me. Like, the SD card slot has been an absolute lifesaver many times. And also that extra port on the right side has been huge as well. So there's been times like when I'm on a plane or in a tight workspace where having a port on the right side was so convenient since I couldn't stretch the cord to get to the left side. And just having that SD card slot also means that you don't need to carry around a dongle, or you don't need to attach an external SSD or anything like that. You don't have to transfer files and then plug that into here. Like, this saves time by having the SD card slot there, and it's so convenient. And I'm not somebody who uses the HDMI slot at all on my MacBooks, but if you are somebody who does that and you hook it up to an external display, that could be another big reason to choose the Pro over the Air. And speaking of connectivity, we also have to talk about the Wi-Fi and Bluetooth speeds, because there's also a difference here. So the M5 MacBook Air gets Wi-Fi 7 and Bluetooth 6, whereas the MacBook Pro M5 is still on Wi-Fi 6E and Bluetooth 5.3. So wireless connectivity like Wi-Fi will be faster. You'll get faster speeds on the Air over the Pro if you have like a Wi-Fi 7 router, for example, and also your Bluetooth devices could perform better as well, because Bluetooth 6, you might have more stable connection, you might have longer, area where it can connect to. So just Bluetooth and Wi-Fi in general might be better for you on the MacBook Air. I haven't really noticed a major difference. Like, for me, I have noticed a difference in Wi-Fi speeds because I do have a Wi-Fi 7 router, but with Bluetooth, I haven't really noticed a major difference there. But then again, I don't really use a lot of Bluetooth devices with my MacBook. Now, you might be wondering, what about the performance? So both of these guys have the M5 chip inside. Is there really even a difference in performance? And the answer is yes, actually there is. And the big difference comes down to the fact that the MacBook Pro has a fan inside, whereas the MacBook Air does not. Now, if you're just doing a little task for like 5-10 minutes, it's not going to be any difference because the fan's not going to kick on the MacBook Pro. But where you're going to see the big difference is in sustained performance, like performance over a long period of time. And that's because the fan inside is going to prevent the MacBook from thermal throttling. So if your work involves exporting long 4K or 8K videos, if you're compiling large code bases, or if you're just doing anything that takes more than a minute or two, especially if it's related to running local LLMs, you're going to notice a difference on the Pro. Like, otherwise, the MacBook Air is perfectly fine. And especially if you look at the actual specs as well, because both of these have 16 gigs of RAM, you can spec it up to 32 gigs. And the MacBook Pro starts at 1 terabyte of storage, whereas the Air starts at 512. And by the way, if you're upgrading from an M4 Air to an M5 Air, if you're like looking to see like if there's a difference between the two, just know that it has double the SSD read and write performance over the M4 Air. The M5 Air does. So that's a big advantage there. And the Air is also configurable up to 4 terabytes of storage for the very first time. So really in terms of specs, there's not a big difference between the two, which is kind of crazy because usually there's been quite a gap. There's usually been like the Air has such low starting storage that you may as well just get the Pro because once you upgrade you're close to the Pro price. But this year it's not really the same. It's very different this year, and it's really Pro Air now compared to like wanting you to spend up and get the Pro, I feel like. And to be honest, I've used both the Air and the Pro several times to edit videos in Final Cut Pro, and I really hardly ever notice a big difference between the two. Like only if my video is like over 20 minutes and I use a lot of blur effects and a lot of very specific things where the fan kicks on, I will notice it exports faster. Like it exports faster in general, but it's not like a huge difference like I thought it would be. And it's definitely not worth paying $700 more for. So I think most people don't even push the MacBook Air to its limits, let alone the MacBook Pro. So I think for most people, MacBook Air in terms of performance is going to be perfectly fine. Now, when it comes to the speakers inside, the speakers are going to be better on the MacBook Pro, hands down. This is an area where no matter the size, if you get a 15-inch MacBook Air and compare it to a 14-inch MacBook Pro, the MacBook Pro is still going to sound better. The speakers inside are just better. And that's because we have a high fidelity 6-speaker sound system with force canceling woofers, whereas we only have a 4-speaker setup on the Air. And of course, I notice this with music or when I'm playing back a video, but I also notice this with spoken voice, like dialogue. When I'm on a FaceTime call, the voices sound better. Like there's a little bit more bass and it just doesn't sound as tinny on the Pro as it does on the Air. So pretty much any scenario you use the speakers for, it's gonna sound better on the Pro. And then in terms of the microphone is also going to be better on the MacBook Pro. Like I'm somebody who always uses an external microphone. Like I would never use my internal mic for anything professional. But if you're in a pinch, I guess, and you need that, the MacBook Pro is absolutely going to be better there as well. And Apple says they both have a 3-mic array with directional beamforming, but the Pro just has studio quality in front of it. So it's better, and it also has a high signal to noise ratio on top of the directional beamforming. Now let's talk about battery life, because the battery life on the MacBooks has been good for a long time. It's never really been a topic of debate where you're like, I'm gonna choose the Pro over the Air because of battery life. It's really never been like that because battery life has just always been great on both, and it's really no different this year. So Apple rates the M5 MacBook Air for 15 hours of wireless web browsing, and they rate the Pro for 16 hours. So when you just look at that, you'd think, okay, well, battery life's probably the same on both of these, but that's not the case because you're not just using the MacBook Pro to web browse all day. At least I hope not, otherwise you wasted your money. But you know, I've noticed that the MacBook Pro, when I'm doing the tasks that I'm doing on it, which is usually video editing, photo editing, and more intensive tasks in general, I've noticed that the battery life, still lasts longer. So I'm pushing the MacBook Pro harder than the MacBook Air, and it still is lasting longer, like usually by at least an hour to 2 hours longer on any given day. And don't get me wrong, I've also edited on the MacBook Air as well and compared the battery life there. It's just the MacBook Air gets really hot sometimes and it might throttle, so that will also drain battery a little bit. So I've noticed on average probably about an hour and a half more battery life on the MacBook Pro. So Apple only rates it for an hour more, but I've noticed it's actually a little bit more than that. The MacBook Pro is the battery king by like at least an hour and a half in my experience. And both of these support fast charging, so they can get up to 50% in 30 minutes, but the Air requires a 70-watt adapter and the Pro requires a 96-watt adapter. So that's also something important to note, especially again, it comes down to traveling. The Air is just so much easier to travel with, also because you don't need as big of a block to charge it up fast. Okay, so should you spend $700 more to get the MacBook Pro over the MacBook Air? And this is where it gets a little bit interesting, because I would say that if you're looking for a laptop for general tasks like web browsing, web apps, some coding or professional office applications, I think the decision is very simple. Just get the MacBook Air and don't even think twice about it. I mean, it's so portable, it's so light, you get the fun colors, you get the 512 gigs of starting storage, 16 gigs of RAM. There's really nothing missing from the MacBook Air if you're using it for those reasons. But I will say that if you're somebody making money from your laptop and you're maybe in the creative field and you need that SD card slot, you need that HDMI port, you need the 1 terabyte of starting storage, you might need the better display for when you're working with HDR content, MacBook Pro is going to be the one for you. And let me just say, it's not just for content creators. Like I'm talking about coders, like if you're somebody who has a large code base, this is going to be great to have the MacBook Pro for that sustained performance. If you're somebody who works a lot with AI and local LLMs, if you're an engineer who does a lot of, 3D modeling and things like that, you're going to see better performance. And you're going to really be glad that you got the Pro over the span of the next few years, especially once you start wearing down, the system. The Air is going to be really hard without the fan when you're pushing it as hard as you would those type of workflows on a Pro. And plus you have the nano texture display option, which is also a nice bonus and a nice plus, at least for me. Now I also want to mention a predicament that I've been in myself, and I've seen a lot of people have this predicament, and that is, what do I do if the 13-inch MacBook Air is too small but the 16-inch MacBook Pro is too big? And I would say that if you're in that situation, you're probably deciding between the 15-inch MacBook Air and the 14-inch MacBook Pro, and there's a $500 price difference between those two. So what should you do? Well, if you're somebody who needs extra storage as well, if you bumped the MacBook Air up to the same specs as the MacBook Pro, so if you upgraded the 512 gigs of storage to 1 terabyte, you're now looking at a $200 difference only. And I would say at that point, go with the Pro hands down. Like the display on the Pro is so much better. Of course, you have the speakers, the microphone's better. You have the nano display option, the possibility of that. You have the fan inside. I would say in that situation, just go with the 14-inch, the base model M5 MacBook Pro. And of course, the port selection as well is another big one. But I will say that, I was somebody who always thought the 13-inch MacBook Air was too small for like several years. But over the past like 2 or 3 years, I've really come around to using the 13-inch MacBook Air and really respecting and loving the small form factor of it. I just increased my text size so I can see it better from like far back, but I've grown to actually love the 13-inch MacBook Air. So if you haven't used one in a while, my other suggestion would be to just pick it up or just go into the store or maybe just get one. And if you don't like it after like a couple of weeks, return it to Apple and upgrade to the MacBook Pro. Okay, so now you might be wondering, which one am I choosing? So like I said in the intro, I'm not lying. My M5 MacBook Pro has been collecting dust ever since the M5 MacBook Air came out. And I think it's because the M5 Air for the first time feels like I can actually do work on it, because before the starting storage was 256 and that was just too small. I never felt like I could actually do something with that. Like I couldn't actually have a Final Cut project on the MacBook Air and be happy about it. It's going to slow down because I'm running out of storage. But with 512, it makes a big difference. Now I feel like I can actually work on it without an external SSD, necessary. So for that reason, I've been using the MacBook Air a lot more than I thought. And also I've noticed that I just use the MacBook Air literally for every single thing I do around the house. Like if I'm in town, I'm using the MacBook Air for literally every single thing. I'm only using the MacBook Pro these days for video editing while I'm traveling. So if I'm traveling and I have a big project I need to do, if I need to edit a lot on the plane and in the hotel, or if I'm going to an event, like I was just at WWDC, I brought the MacBook Pro because I'm going to be doing more sustained tasks like video editing and importing a lot of footage and things like that. So I bring the MacBook Pro for scenarios like that. But if I'm not doing that, I'm using the MacBook Air literally like 90% of the time. That, the MacBook Pro is like 10% of the time. MacBook Air is 90% of the time because it just does everything I need it to do. It's fast and now has much better storage option at 512 for the base model. And it's just great. I just love carrying it around. It's just so convenient and easy. When I'm going to a coffee shop, when I'm in bed, when I'm on FaceTime, things like that, MacBook Air all day long. But anyways, I hope this video was helpful for you trying to decide between the M5 MacBook Air and the M5 MacBook Pro. So if you have one of these, let me know which one you have down in the comment section below. And what was your thought process behind buying one over the other? Do you agree with my statement? Do you disagree with my statement? Let me know all your thoughts down in the comments below. But anyways, guys, thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon.